So we're coming to the second half of our morning, and we just had a great practical session there in relation to schools and to education, and it's a great delight in this second half to welcome both Arwen and Brendan, who are going to share something of their insights and experiences. Arwen gave this the title of Stepping Outside in Faith.
See what I did there?
And then we'll hear about creating a forest church. So it's over to you, Arwen, and thank you for being here.
Lovely, thank you very much. It is lovely to be here with you. And given that I am here among my brothers and sisters in Christ, I'm going to begin with a confession. Before the 18th of March 2020, I loved being the priest of a beautiful Anglo-Catholic building, to lead worship within the architecture of centuries. Smoke, bells, vestments, choreographed liturgy, very beautiful, all to raise the senses well above the earthly and natural. Safe and secure within our walls, people sat neatly in their pews, knowing when they'd come in, knowing when they'd leave, and knowing what we would do next. Then suddenly, government announcement. Slam went the church door. The place that fed, the well that quenched, the sacred space that shaped our spiritual lives was now inaccessible. Exiled. I cried. My buildings. As the rector of East Blatchington and Bishopstone, I have two buildings. One Anglo-Saxon, the oldest in Sussex, you can debate me that later, in a rural hamlet with views over the South Downs and the coast, and the other a village church with far more houses around it now than when it was first built for its rural farming community. And so with both buildings we found ourselves in the first lockdown. And so, like so many others, we found ourselves going online. You get the idea. I'm not going to bore you with the noise of my churchyard. Now, first of all, I began by trying to recreate the church in my tiny study. Full-size altar on a desk, all the pressed linens, the frontals, candle holders, all transported over from the church and squidged in with clever camera angles, carefully planted to make it look as much like the inside of our church as possible. But I also went online as part of my daily walk, and I walked through the churchyard. And I live streamed a few words, a little prayer, a thought for the day. I offered the Benedictus, a blessing, and the Lord's Prayer. And I was amazed by the popularity of these little videos. I saw how many more new to us people were engaging with me when I was outside, and I began to reflect upon it. Now, was there something about listening to the words of faith against the background noise of a choir of birdsong, framed by the intense freshness of the earth's spring greens, prayers for light and for life being illuminated by the sunshine which brings forth both? I realised that much of the outside appealed to the same set of senses that our Sunday sacramental liturgy sought to appeal to, but that it did so potentially to a wider, newer and broader group of people. So the entrepreneurial evangelist within me fast realised the missiological importance of all of this. How, of course, creation would be a fantastic setting, a suitable illustration for the story and the words of the Creator to be shared, especially in this hour of profound need. So the enduring popularity of God's word being heard outside, we found was opening our church's message and mission up to people who were tuning into us every single day, only when I was outside, despite admitting in the comments, I'm not churchy, I'm not religious. You know the form. This early engagement made me realise that the churchyard was more than just a place of passing through or a way to get into the church. And so our stepping outside in faith was caused by necessity, but turned into something quite different for us. And I'd like to share with you the story of that today. I haven't organised all of these, so they're going to come up in a rather eclectic manner. That said, they will illustrate what I'm doing at the back. We discovered, much like was mentioned this morning, that our churchyard changed to become part of our church. It became an open-air extension of sorts, a grassy and tree-lined chapel. We discovered that our churchyard was the melding of a public and sacred space, where the churched and the unchurched could mingle, where safety wasn't just about viruses, but about making those first and tentative steps towards faith. It offered fresh perspectives for our more established members, and it was safe for explorers, inquirers, the unsure, the seeking, the searching, and those in need. And this discovery manifested for us in 3 fields: the pastoral, the spiritual, and the missional. And so I'm going to share these with you today, the fruit of my theological reflections on what we did during the pandemic. Your churchyard will be different to mine, your parish different to ours, but given that people are people, and watching the impact of being outside upon my parishioners, whether churchgoers or not, I hope that some of these reflections may be relevant for you, whether to offer inspiration or affirmation of what you are already doing. It was by accident that we put benches in place just as the rules were relaxing to allow meeting up outside, and we had no benches in our churchyard at that point. We replaced old ones with new ones, and I promise we got List B faculties for the other ones. Not just benches for 2 people though, but corner benches that would seat 7 or 8. And I then let the people know when I was to be outside, wrapped up warm in a coat with my flask of tea, and I welcomed anyone to join me there, by appointment or whether by chance. And the churchyard suddenly had something of a village green feel to it, a space of community, intentional, central, somewhere to stop and chat, not to hustle through at haste. And instead of private chats which might have once happened in my study or in the church hall, we would be joined by unexpected people stopping, "Morning, how are you? Stay safe." And if I sat there by myself for an hour, someone or something would come my way, and I noticed how the talking was easy, deep, rich, and very honest. So fed up with Zoom, I began to use these same churchyard spaces for my funeral visits. And there was something quite different about sitting with families in the churchyard to talk about their bereavement, their plans for the funeral. It was as if our conversations were framed by the normality of death and the passage of time marked by the gravestones, as the gift of life and the newness of each day was marked by the birdsong and the plants. They were very, very different to the visits conducted in living rooms or on Zoom. People behave differently when they're outdoors, I learnt from these encounters. There is a dimension to these conversations that is helped by being in this space where sacred and public intersect so very naturally. Before the pandemic, my daughter and I had made a pilgrimage to Whipsnade in Bedfordshire. And while lions and elephants were a part of our later in that day out, we first of all stopped off at the Whipsnade Tree Cathedral. Have you been there? Oh, I highly recommend it. If you're a National Trust member, it's on your list. So you may or may not know then that the Whipsnade Tree Cathedral was planted as a living memorial after the First World War. And different species of trees mark out the different chapels and chancels. You can guess what the Christmas chapel holds. And the remembrance there of both death and life, woven into the shape of walls and chancels, naves and chapels familiar to us all, is an incredibly interesting thing. My daughter and I loved tracking the familiar contours of a cathedral, but experiencing them differently because the colours, the sounds, the smells were so different, literally fresh and alive. Being there reminded me of the medieval scholastic Thomas Aquinas, a significant proponent of natural theology, writing of how the book of nature should be read alongside the book of Scripture, for God's revelation will be seen in both. And I confess, another confession, to also being rather fond of that Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin, known well to these parts, having been ordained and celebrated his first Mass and hunting for fossils just down the road there in Hastings. De Chardin, like Aquinas, recognised the potential of nature to convey and point towards the revelation of God. And in Chardin's experience, long after he'd been in Hastings, he finds himself in China, without building, without vessels or elements, wanting to consecrate the Eucharist. And this leads him into this incredibly beautiful mystical prayer, where he sees the whole world's potential to be the host for the precious new creation, for the cosmic body of Christ. And so, by drawing from de Chardin and Aquinas, I began to alleviate my fears of paganism or pantheism by being outside. And when considering the spiritual of the outdoors, I instead remembered that line in Genesis: God walked in the cool of the garden where he sought Adam and Eve. Where are you, he says. I began to wonder whether in our churchyards, within this universal connection of the beauty of nature shared by our parishioners, churched and unchurched, in their pastoral need, God was indeed there, walking through the garden, seeking to find them. I thought so, I think so, and in fact I now know so. The birds' song in the increasing light of the dawn, emerging behind the trees as I celebrated the Eucharist on Easter morning, was really rather incredible. The gold of the altar frontal and chasuble and the silverware of the chalice and ciborium glistened in a brand new way when presented there in the churchyard. The 30 people standing around at 5:30 in the morning, wrapped up warm and bleary-eyed from such an early start, were all rather inspired. And they were the faithful, seeing their long familiar ritual in a brand new way. God walking through the garden, Jesus revealing himself to Mary Magdalene. It was all rather spectacular. And I saw that people are surprisingly up for being outside. They're prepared to dress up warm, get up very early, even weather the elements to a point, but most of all to yearn for an experience that reframes their understanding of church, their faith, or the things they've always taken for granted. Now, we are not a prayer-walking parish in the usual understanding of that term, and walking between our two parishes over the fields for rogation was a rather lost tradition. But we re-established it, based on the fact that if people can get up dawn to stand in the churchyard, that they'll manage a quick walk over the fields. And so, halfway between our two parishes, standing on a rock in good Cornish tradition, for that is where I'm from, we prayed and blessed for our community, for safekeeping, invocation of the Spirit, protection and safety of angels, and we read Gerard Manley Hopkins's poem, The Wind Hover, recited on the rock at the highest point in our parish. We had also kept a very quiet Corpus Christi inside the church in previous years, but unable to be there and beginning to see this immense value of being outdoors, we took the Blessed Sacrament outside. We blessed the four corners of our parish without apology, strew rose petals on the road, full smoke, full humour of veil, no apology, spoke about it online, explained the tradition. More people came the following year, and people in our area began asking, "When are you doing that thing again?" And the churchyard itself. Well, we discovered that people like hanging around, so we started to make that a bit more interesting for them. Our Christmas crib, our Easter garden, which we never had before, became icons within our churchyard, people making a small residential pilgrimage to bring their families to look at them. And I got emails and comments, and then last Christmas a member of the parish contacted me to offer to arrange that our Christmas crib could be the final station in a set of Advent windows, nothing to do with us. A trail was set, the people followed it, and ended up there with us in our churchyard on Christmas Eve. So we held a crib service outdoors. We sensed the crib, told the story, and were amazed as that congregation kept growing and growing. People could hear and came to see what was happening. The churchyard may not be a Wesleyan preaching pit, but it does seem to have something of that in its reach. So the churchyard we have found is a place of deep and rich contemplation. We have embraced it, facilitated it, and tried to build on what it already does well. And I know that we are not alone in using our outdoors in numerous different ways. And I began with a confession, because a confession often leads to a conversion. But we haven't just stopped at the churchyard, because for some of the reasons that some of you have highlighted already, there are objections to being among the graves. So we began to extend out our understanding of the green spaces in our parish. And we have been consistently amazed at how willing people are to work with us, letting us borrow and bless the public spaces of green around us, enabling us to take our preaching pit mission to places of a wider reach. Pet services by the pond, 80 people turning up to carols in a piece of grass in the middle of the Bishopstone village, all sorts of things where we have stepped outside, newly confident, have given us immeasurable results. So appreciating the potential and openness for people to feel comfortable in coming to join us, becoming comfortable with the risk assessments and safety measures that need to be in place, we have gone for it in so many ways. And somehow, these tentative steps outside of our building have made us much more confident about who we are in this parish. We're more vocal, more public, more ready to invite others to come and be part of what we're doing. And we don't just hide our worship and teaching in the building anymore. Well, a fine example of this is this. You will have seen the sheep in the pictures. They are because we laid out a shepherd's trail for Advent, tying these sheep up all over the parish and setting families off in their own little groups to engage with the QR codes that were on the sheep and the Christmas story. And we only did this because it was a way of interpreting the rules and doing something rather than nothing at all. We set the family groups off from our church. They went down the hill, round the pond, up the Twitton and back into our churchyard. And with their mobile phones, they scanned the QR codes, which gave them images, snippets of the story, a carol to sing together, or a prayer for them to literally stand where they are together and look upwards and around and see what they could hear and see. And we discovered something surprising and beautiful. The parents were far more relaxed with having their children outside, would you believe it? And they loved having the material of faith in their own hands. They loved leading their own children in exploring the faith in the outdoors. And they all returned to the church wide-eyed and full of delight at this wonderful time they had had with each other, and I think walking with God in the cool of the garden. The outside for those families offered freedom, exploration and an unfettered faith, and it was a new way of church being church. And some of those families are still engaging with us now. We still take them outdoors. Our Cafe Church members were prepared for confirmation by using rocks on the beach to learn about the creeds, building cairns, towers with foundation stones, and then renewing their baptismal promises at the shoreline. And our Little Fishes toddler group are to be met by a donkey. Well, it's a small horse with big ears, but I think we'll get away with it. Borrowed from one of the local farmers as they finish their procession on this coming Palm Sunday afternoon. But do you know what? We didn't have any regular or real children's ministry before this. This all came out of our Shepherd's Trail. I'm not going to list everything we've done. You've probably seen most of it on the slideshow behind me. But I do want to bring this little story, this little testimonial to a close by saying that using our churchyard began out of necessity and with a great deal of reluctance and nervousness, and has undoubtedly been part of our church's growth story. The use of outside is a safe and sacred space for people on the margins and the edges to come along and mix with those who are more mature. And some take that further and come inside. Some only ever come to the outdoor things. Some find themselves passing by and engaging with us by accident. And some find themselves surprised by the fact that the church isn't wedded to being inside anymore. We still love our building, and I rejoice that we can now go back in, sing, ring bells and smoke the incense the smoke. But we've somehow extended our church, our reach and our mission. And we have new services as part of our offering. Being outdoors is now part of our life. And we now think to use the wider parish wherever we can, extending beyond the churchyard into the areas around us. I think that we are bolder with new people and have a new confidence with who we are and a new expansiveness with who our people are. And our worship is richer for it, because we have genuinely come to see that God is there, walking through the cool of his garden, looking for his people. And that is our story. I think we have 5 minutes, don't we? I want to hear what you've been doing. Or if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. But what have you been doing? What there resonated? What have you seen happening in your own parishes that actually connects with the story that we have witnessed? We can't surely be the only ones.
The trails, like an Easter trail or an Advent trail, or those attract people, families in great numbers comparatively. And then if you do the final event in the churchyard, like, come and collect your prize or something, but that works, and then they come back, and the next time you do a trail, they say, oh yeah, fine, so that is something we have done in Denton, and yes, it works.
Thank you. Adam?
What resistance did you have to some of these things happening, and how did you carry people along with you? And also, in terms of people, resources, what have you got?
Okay, so the first one, resistance. I just use, we're just experimenting. And if people are grumbling, well, we're just going to give it a go and we'll see what happens. We did do an open afternoon at Bishopstone in the graveyard. And we did get a little bit of resistance about that, and I don't think we would do that again because I think it was just a little bit too close to the mark. But that is because we have got another little green space that we could use instead. So we've had to be very sensitive and very much tell us what you think when we try these things, rather than this is what we're doing, and we don't care what anybody thinks. I also use social media very positively, so I'm just telling people all the time this is what we're doing and why we're doing it, and here's some lovely pictures, and that seems to really help a lot. I think people feel engaged, they're not sort of sprung on, things aren't sprung on them. In terms of people, we don't have a huge number of people, and I think one of the reasons that our churches were so hiding inside was because people were older, and so being outside involves putting chairs out because people can't stand for so long. But we had to do some real work around, but we aren't the people that we're looking for. And look at what's happening in our community. Everybody's going out for a walk once a day. It was kind of being forced outside. It was, I think that propelled it really. I think if I just suggested it, it wouldn't have happened. But because that was what was happening in society, we just need to join in with that. And then I think the fruits began to speak for themselves. Yeah. But in terms of people, the Shepherd's Trail was remarkably low. Putting the signs up was a thing, but actually we had 2 people in the church and we just had a little pack and sent them all off. I mean, it was amazingly, we thought all the effort we put into Messy Church the year before, where we were trying to entertain children for 2.5 hours, we just sat there for a whole day and sent everybody off, and they sort of all came back, like, just amazing. God kind of did the work for us. It was quite extraordinary. But those families so valued being trusted with the faith. That's what we got from it. It wasn't a case of bring your children and we will give them faith. It was actually, these are your children, this is your family, here are the things you need, we'll help you. And then they were all stopping by the pond apparently, just gazing and saying a prayer for creation. Quite amazing, without it being some frenetic kind of leader at the front leading them to do it. We were really surprised, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, coming back to this resistance about people using the churchyard, which particularly distressed by the comments from my colleagues on the right. I'm afraid to host family service refreshments out in the graveyard the other day, using a tabletop tube as the table and serving the wine from that. But is there a way that we can almost theologically produce something collectively to say we don't believe this is offensive spiritually, or do we just have to live with the fact that some people will be offended by it? I'm sorry, it's deeply inarticulate, but you can see where I'm driving toward.
Do you know it's not though, because actually we're an Easter people, we're not just about Good Friday, and actually it is life and death. It's, believing that there's a life after death. And so where there was a little bit of resistance, I was able to sort of just push that a little bit and say, actually we're a living church. We're not just here for those who have passed away or those who are bereaved, which one of our churches was in decline, and that was very much the narrative, it was just, that's all we ever prayed for. That's, so actually weaving life in there, but it does need careful handling. I think the point was made earlier about how recent the graves are, and I think that's really true. It's much easier for us to use one part of the churchyard which is ancient, than it is to use the other. We steered well clear of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is very true, because we've got a very ancient churchyard, and we have a churchyard working party once a month in the summer, and we do go on the graves to weed them.
Yes.
But you wouldn't do it on a new grave for some reason.
No.
Why? But it seems all right on them. But some people say, no, you shouldn't. But we think, oh, we would have that if we've grown. We like to.
I think there's something really celebratory about having booze on a table.
Yeah, we do. I think as I said to you earlier on, when I'm 6 feet under, I want people to party on top.
Absolutely, I mean, it's a hugely positive thing when you think sort of linking in with what some cultures do, like having family parties in the grave, you know, like the Mexican Day of the Dead and that sort of thing. It could actually, and that idea of the community of the living and the dead, it can be really interesting and liberating.
But I guess if we asked the diocese to opine on the subject, that's setting them up the most appalling amount of abuse, there's a completely naive statement on that.
I think I had a lot of questions. Is this legal? Are we allowed to do this? That was a really big deal. So actually something that said, you can do this, these are the pastoral implications, here's a theological justification, you know, actually because of our faith, and this isn't dishonouring or disrespectful. But then that always has to be interpreted, doesn't it, correctly for the context. I think different ones will be more sensitive.
Sorry, I mean, I think it's not impossible that some kind of pro forma sort of form of words could be found about that, so I'll try and do some work.
Fabulous.
Brilliant.
Oh, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
I was just, you were talking about theology, but of course, historically, where we've worshipped has been entwined with the dead. You know, when you think about where St. Peter's Basilica is, for example, in Rome, Christians right from day dot have worshipped the Lord amongst the graves. I mean, you go into the catacombs, it strikes me the only difference between a catacomb and a graveyard is one gets rained on. So actually, in terms of the history of our faith, there shouldn't be anything theologically. It's just being able to sort of condense it quickly.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for listening to me. I'm going to hand over now to the one I'm really looking forward to, Brendan on Forest Church.